What's going on, everyone? Corey Schaffer here from the Til Valhalla Project, and this year we have made 792 memorial plaques for the families of fallen heroes. If you don't know what we do, we make memorial plaques for the families of fallen heroes and hand deliver them to their doorstep at a complete surprise anywhere in the United States. So right now we're going to call roll. We want a moment of silence, but we're going to display all the heroes that we have helped make memorials for in the year 2023. Thank you for your support.
K-9 Duco, U.S. Army.
Corporal and Sergeant First Class Harry G. Green, USMC, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Kenneth Phillips, U.S. Army.
Sergeant First Class Gary M. Shirley, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Miguel A. Contos, Coffee County Sheriff's Office.
Corporal Miguel A. Contreras Jr., U.S. Marine Corps, Coffee County Sheriff's Department.
Sergeant Bryce Lawrence, U.S. Marine Corps.
Master Sergeant Thomas W. Lovell, U.S. Army.
Corporal Bobby J. Miller, U.S. Marine Corps.
Corporal Robert E. Holleran, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Holly R. Belinsky, U.S. Army Reserves.
Staff Sergeant Christopher M. Simonton, U.S. Air Force.
Specialist Michael C. Wargo, U.S. Army.
Corporal John C. Riley, U.S. Marine Corps.
Private First Class Jedediah Jones, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant John F. Santos, U.S. National Guard, Plymouth County Sheriff's Office.
Sergeant Joshua P. Little, U.S. Army. Captain Ross A. Reynolds, U.S. Marine Corps.
Specialist Alan N. Dixis, U.S. Army.
Specialist Gregory S. Weddle, U.S. Army.
Senior Airman Jason T. Plight, U.S. Air Force.
Corporal James W. Cravens, United States Marine Corps.
Seaman John W. Ettinger, U.S. Navy. Corporal Anthony B. Ord, U.S. Marine Corps.
Lance Corporal Brandon A. Thornhill, U.S. Marine Corps.
Technical Sergeant James A. Richardson, the United Air Force.
Corporal and Deputy Clayton A. Osteen, U.S. Marine Corps, in St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office.
Petty Officer 2nd Class John T. Wilkins Jr., U.S. Navy.
First Lieutenant Megan I. Arsenal, U.S. Army. EMT Catherine L. Brown, Pend Oral Fire District Number 4.
Corporal Peter N. Klemick, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Stephen C. Jeffrey, U.S. Army.
First Lieutenant Robert A. Harrison, United States Army.
Firefighter Brett A. Corbs, Swansea Fire Department.
Sergeant James W. Fisk, U.S. Army.
Specialist Teresa A. Bird, U.S. Army.
Lance Corporal Armando Hernandez, U.S. Marine Corps.
Lance Corporal Jake L. Farewell III, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer First Class David E. Klein, U.S. Navy.
Lance Corporal Alexander Garcia, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer Second Class Gregory E. Linsky, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant Adam M. Selinsky, U.S. Marine Corps.
Corporal and Police Officer Greg L. Capolino, U.S. Army, NYPD, and Suffolk County Police Department.
Specialist Cody R. Bond, Army National Guard.
Lieutenant Daniel C. Dundas, Casper Police Department.
Deputy Sheriff and EMT Brandon A. Shirley, Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, Louisville Metro EMS.
Senior Airman and Police Officer Kevin Dorr Jr., U.S. Air Force, Philadelphia Police Department.
Technical Sergeant Eric W. Buell, United States Air Force, Philadelphia Police Department.
Petty Officer First Class and Police Officer Corwin A. Booker Jr., United States Navy, Richmond Police Department.
Sergeant and Police Officer Cal R. Squires, U.S. Army, and Seattle Police Department.
Senior Chief Petty Officer Williams L. Duke, the United Navy.
Sergeant and Officer Anthony J. Pankowski, U.S. Marine Corps, and Bridgeport Police Department.
Specialist Ryan G. Clark, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Zachary W. Rifle, U.S. Marine Corps.
Private Dwayne L. Campling, U.S. Army.
Specialist Bradley W. Loach, U.S. Army.
Lance Corporal Matthew R. Smith, U.S. Marine Corps.
Specialist Caleb T. George, U.S. Army.
Lieutenant Colonel Michael J. McCloskey, U.S. Air Force.
Officer Holden L. Hare, Church Point Police Department.
Sergeant Guadalupe J. Torres, U.S. Army.
Corporal Ryan C. McGee, U.S. Army.
Firefighter Tyler L. Warfield, Clear Spring Fire Rescue.
Army Specialist Brady J. Hammer, Army National Guard.
Sergeant Matthew B. Moody, U.S. Marine Corps. Private First Class George W. Weldy Jr., U.S. Marine Corps.
Lance Corporal and Deputy Dennis E. Fish, United States Marine Corps, Abraham County Sheriff's Office.
Lance Corporal Matthew D. Coate, United States Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant Alma A. Worthington, Army National Guard.
Private First Class J.R. Salvacion, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Wyatt S. McNutley, U.S. Army.
Deputy Austin C. Walsh, Brevard County Sheriff's Office.
Private First Class Tommy C. Young, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Bruce A. Ferry, U.S. Air Force.
Private Stephen T. Applegate, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Natalie D. Garvin, the United Army.
Detective Joseph A. Seals, Jersey City Police Department.
Private Second Class J.H. Crocker, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Joshua W. Waters, U.S. Air Force.
Commander Donald R. Hubbs, U.S. Navy.
Specialist Clifford L. Moxley Jr., Army National Guard.
Seaman Thomas J. Hafner, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant Alex A. Rabago, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Ryan M. Pirtle, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer Second Class and Firefighter Francis E. Jones, U.S. Navy, Carneys Point Fire and Rescue.
Private First Class Kenneth E. Meyer, U.S. Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant Jackie W. Cox, United States Army.
Corporal and Sergeant Scott D. Mersch, U.S. Marine Corps, Army National Guard.
Petty Officer First Class Patrick D. Feeks, United States Navy.
Chief Warrant Officer 2, Gilbert E. Holcomb, U.S. Army.
Corporal Stephen W. Scammahorn, U.S. Army.
Police Captain Frank K. Rizak Jr., Los Angeles Sheriff's Department and Carroll County Sheriff's Office.
Senior Airman Harley A. Landis, U.S. Air Force.
Specialist Andre Chernigovic, U.S. Army.
Second Lieutenant Vito A. Valenzuela, U.S. Air Force.
Corporal Jordan R. Station, the United Marine Corps.
Private James C. Crosswhite, U.S. Army.
Senior Airman John E. King II, U.S. Air Force.
Senior Airman Pedro Maldonado II, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant Justin R. Karras, U.S. Marine Corps.
Senior Master Sergeant Herbert H. McKinney II, U.S. Air Force.
Private First Class Matthew R. Cottrell, U.S. Army.
Master Sergeant Aaron P. Caldwell, United States Air Force.
Petty Officer 3rd Class and Battalion Chief Robert J. Bodley Jr., U.S. Navy and Community Fire Protection District.
Senior Airman Peyton W.S. Wentes, United States Air Force.
Petty Officer 2nd Class Russell L. Williams, U.S. Navy.
Petty Officer 3rd Class Frankie M. Soto Lopez, U.S. Coast Guard.
Chief Petty Officer Justin A. Calderon, U.S. Navy.
Chief Master Sergeant Cameron C.R. Bailey, U.S. Air National Guard.
Seaman Apprentice Caleb C. Pacheco, U.S. Navy.
Specialist Kenneth D. Walls Jr., Army National Guard.
Staff Sergeant Joshua S. Brulina, U.S. Marine Corps.
Electrician's Mate, 2nd Class, William J. Murphy, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant Adam Hugstep Lepore, U.S. Army.
Corporal Joshua A. Dickinson, United States Marine Corps.
Petty Officer First Class Anthony Borland, U.S. Navy.
Fire Marshal Eddie D. Fender, Asheville Fire Department.
Corporal Stephen A. Rintamaki, U.S. Marine Corps.
Private First Class Juan A. Mars, U.S. Army.
Specialist Angel L. Galindo, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Michael D. Smith, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Daniel C. Britton, United States Army.
Private First Class Anthony K. Saxon, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Ryan C. Osment, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Charles D. Pinkney Jr., U.S. Army.
Captain Eric Wright Goldsmith, the United Army.
First Lieutenant Justice R. Stewart, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant First Class Frankie G. Willard, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer First Class Stephen G. Daughtry, U.S. Navy.
Corporal Sean R. Boyer, U.S. Marine Corps.
Deputy Sheriff Joshua Edwin Blyler, St. Johns County Sheriff's Office.
Private First Class James F. McClamrock, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Jessica M. Ames, U.S. Marine Corps.
Chief Petty Officer Tommy L. Allen, U.S. Navy.
Chief Petty Officer Austin M. Walters, U.S. Navy.
Specialist Jason A. Disney Sr., U.S. Army.
EMT Firefighter Abby L. Kramer, Hershey Medical Center and Sudberg Fire Company.
Sergeant First Class Kevin J. Ellis, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Major Ernest H. Paul Sr., U.S. Army.
Specialist Timothy R. Lagasse, Army National Guard.
Sergeant Jax D. Ruick, the United States Army.
Petty Officer 3rd Class and Sergeant Daniel C. Fullhart, United States Navy, Army National Guard, Volunteer Mulberry Fire Department.
Private First Class Richard G. Walker, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer 3rd Class Randy R. Wright, U.S. Navy.
Staff Sergeant Victoire P. Laurence, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Colin W. Cernick, U.S. Marine Corps.
Senior Master Sergeant Dean L. Scott, U.S. Air Force.
Specialist Christopher L. Boren, Sr., U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Darren W. Decker, United States Army.
Sergeant Colton J. Little, Army National Guard. Staff Sergeant Joseph C. Hackworth, U.S. Air Force.
Chief of Police Arnold E. Stanko, U.S. Marine Corps, Middlefield Police Department.
Colonel Charles R. Rambo, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Aaron M. Clark, U.S. Army.
Firefighter J.C. J. Braun, Victoria, Ellis County Fire Department.
Sergeant Alex M. Garbin, the United States Army.
Private First Class Frank J. Castillo, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer First Class Tyler S. McGregor, U.S. Coast Guard.
Corporal Desmond C. Bayard, U.S. Marine Corps.
Corporal and Officer Abel J. Hickman, U.S. Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant Bruce E. Hauser, United States Air Force.
Captain Dale R. Hoff, U.S. Air Force.
Colonel Michael R. Stallman, U.S. Marine Corps.
Deputy Alexander D. Guazdas, Harris County Sheriff's Department.
Lance Corporal and Detective Stephen T. Cosmo, U.S. Marine Corps and Burlington Police Department.
Sergeant Raul Ramirez, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Clifford E. Marshall Sr., U.S. Army.
Sergeant Preston E. Blicky, U.S. Army.
Sergeant and Officer Frank D. Moran III, United States Marine Corps, Howard County Police Department.
Staff Sergeant Morgan C. Robinson, U.S. Army.
Police Officer Sayer R. Evans, U.S. Marine Corps and Wilmington Police Department.
Chief Warrant Officer 4, Chester W. Troxel, Army National Guard.
Corporal Ednall E. Barwick, United States Army.
Private First Class Joshua W. Herndon, U.S. Army.
Corporal Adam M. Wolfel, U.S. Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant Christopher O. Maudry, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Jonathan M. Rossi, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer First Class Ryan A. Schultz, U.S. Coast Guard. Sergeant Joshua F. Andrew, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Thomas P. Crone, U.S. Army.
Seaman Ansel K. Mulhup, U.S. Navy.
Petty Officer 2nd Class William M. Lowe, U.S. Navy.
Army Specialist Justin D. Gastoni, Army National Guard.
Specialist Crystal M. Marie Fitz, United States Army.
Petty Officer First Class and Police Officer David E. Ruiz, U.S. Navy and Dallas Police Department.
Corporal Franklin Pasqualini, U.S. Army.
Seaman John L. Wentling, U.S. Navy.
Captain Thomas T. Shamalis, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Gabriel J. Figueroa, U.S. Army.
Seaman David A. Land, U.S. Navy.
Corporal Adam F. Wolf, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Connor P. Polston, U.S. Marine Corps.
Airman First Class Paul L. Hill, U.S. Air Force.
Specialist Alex Hernandez III, United States Army.
Specialist Craig A. Delano, U.S. Army.
Airman 2nd Class William A. Wunschel II, U.S. Army.
Master Chief Petty Officer Brian C. Berriger, U.S. Navy.
Seaman Recruit David L. Spearman, United States Navy.
Fire Captain Kenneth Krulish, U.S. Navy and St. Johns County Fire Rescue.
Corporal and Staff Sergeant Kenneth W. Messick, U.S. Marine Corps, Army National Guard.
Sergeant Brian N. Kubik, Jr., U.S. Army.
Sergeant First Class Victor M. Santiago, U.S. Army.
Specialist and Firefighter Damon F. Clayton, U.S. Army, Ecorse Fire Department.
Captain Thomas C. McCausland, U.S. Army.
Airman 2nd Class Edward J. Miller, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant Thomas N. Helminger, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Vernon D. Compton, U.S. Army. Gunnery Sergeant Ronnie M. Deckard, U.S. Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant Dennis J. Hansen, U.S. Army.
Specialist Jeremy D. Feidler, United States Army.
Sergeant Major Joseph J. Ellis, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant and Firefighter Derek W. Redmond, U.S. Army, Spring Lake Fire Department.
Specialist Larry W. Gardner, Jr., U.S. Army.
Specialist Gary A. Talbot, U.S. Army Reserve.
Sergeant Evan M. Roden, U.S. Army.
First Sergeant Michael Kofi, Army National Guard.
First Sergeant Christopher J. Lalonde, U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Army.
Private Travis B. Flanagan, U.S. Marine Corps.
Specialist Marvin W. Poser, United States Army.
Sergeant Ryan M. Wood, U.S. Army.
Firefighter and EMT Jason C. Tucker, Pasco County Fire Rescue.
Sergeant and Deputy James A. Hamby, U.S. Marine Corps and Richmond County Sheriff's Office.
Petty Officer 2nd Class John J. Rinko, U.S. Navy.
Chief Deputy Constable Wayne Rhodes, Denton County Constable's Office.
Private First Class William L. Koenig, U.S. Army.
Specialist and Firefighter William C. Bean IV, Army.
Lance Corporal Michael M. Sosby, U.S. Marine Corps.
Private First Class Ricky Salas Jr., U.S. Army.
Specialist Cody O. Moosman, U.S. Army.
Specialist 4 Robert A. Whitenaw, United States Army.
Specialist Jeremy O. Allman, U.S. Army.
Senior Chief Petty Officer Lawrence E. Hewitt, United States Navy.
Master Sergeant Thomas D. Mahalik, U.S. Army. Private Anthony Johnson, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Nicholas J. Leitner, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Andrew J. Maestas, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Brian E. Bolander, U.S. Army.
Motorist Machinist Petty Officer 2nd Class Bernard E. McClendon, U.S. Navy.
Master Chief Petty Officer Patrick J. Sullivan, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant Casey T. Briggs, U.S. Army, Army Reserves.
Chief Warrant Officer 4 Chris J. Streckenbaugh, U.S. Army.
Corporal Alex V. Quayle, U.S. Marine Corps.
Captain and Officer John D. Barber, U.S. Army, South Boston Police Department.
Petty Officer 2nd Class Ryan D. Burris, United States Navy.
Specialist Jeremy D. Walker, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer 3rd Class Jacob E. Slocum, U.S. Navy.
Major Willie P. Winter, Army National Guard.
Sergeant Amanda N. Brazil, United States Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant John R. McGee, U.S. Army.
Deputy Alexander D. Guasdas, Harris County Sheriff's Department.
Colonel James D. Hagan, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Jesse R. D. Smith, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer 3rd Class and Deputy Beach Marshal Ronald A. Parker, U.S. Navy and St. Augustine Beach Police Department.
Technical Sergeant Derek T. Millman, U.S. Air National Guard.
Sergeant First Class Paul J. Montanez, Jr., U.S. Army.
Commissioner Willis E. Fernley, Eagle Mills Fire Department.
Specialist Stephen F. Hine, Army National Guard.
Sergeant First Class Michael W. Strand, U.S. Army.
Specialist Gage M. G. Shellen, U.S. Army.
Major Julian S. Schuster, U.S. Army Air Corps.
Second Lieutenant James P. Blecksmith, United States Marine Corps.
Specialist Donald P. Perry, U.S. Army.
Sergeant First Class Octavio O. Arroyo, U.S. Army.
Corporal and Officer Robin A. Rodriguez, U.S. Marine Corps, and officer in Laredo Independent School District.
Lance Corporal and Firefighter Jason M. Faulkner Sr., United States Marine Corps and Indian River Volunteer Fire Company.
Sergeant Robert G. Allen, U.S. Army.
Specialist and Officer Jeremiah J. Story, Army National Guard, Perry County Sheriff's Office.
Staff Sergeant Craig A. Pruden, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Ernest L. Turley, United States Army.
Petty Officer 2nd Class Michael J. Matthews, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant James W. Harvey, 2nd, U.S. Army.
Corporal Stephanie Rodriguez Cuenca, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer First Class Frederick B. Purvis, Sr., U.S. Navy.
Sergeant First Class and Battalion Chief Raymond E. Roddy, Jr., U.S. Army, West Rowan County Fire Department.
Fire Chief Joseph D. Peralt, Champlain Fire Department.
Master Chief Petty Officer Robert E. Brown, U.S. Navy.
Specialist Edward M. Hager, U.S. Army.
Firefighter Brendan L. Torres, Dalhart Volunteer Fire Department.
Battalion Chief Joshua D. Laird, Frederick County Fire and Rescue Services.
Petty Officer 2nd Class Arthur J. Smith, U.S. Navy.
Staff Sergeant John W. Nichols, U.S. Air Force.
2nd Lieutenant William H. Mixon, Jr., U.S. Army.
Sergeant Charles E. McGuire, U.S. Army.
Specialist Austin L. Valley, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Corey M. Endlich, United States Army.
Specialist Edward M. Hager, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Nicholas J. Johnson, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Brandon A. Highlander, U.S. Air Force.
Corporal Charles H. Reeves, U.S. Army.
Corporal Michael Thrower, U.S. Marine Corps.
First Lieutenant Dennis W. Zelensky, II, U.S. Army.
Lance Corporal Troy J. Martin, U.S. Marine Corps.
Captain Marty J. Plunk, Weakley County Sheriff's Department.
Sergeant Justin T. Story, U.S. Army.
Specialist Claude Perry, U.S. Army.
Specialist Austin J. Moore McDonough, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Christopher L. Slater, Army National Guard.
Captain Carl E. Jackson, U.S. Air Force.
Senior Chief Petty Officer Jason D. Martell, U.S. Navy.
Petty Officer 3rd Class Carrie L. Horrier, U.S. Navy.
Corporal Roy L. Seidel, U.S. Marine Corps.
Major James J. Bowers, U.S. Army.
Lance Corporal Richard Hum, the United Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant William T. Haynes III, U.S. Marine Corps.
Major Eugene W. Sanders, Jr., United States Army.
EMT Catherine L. Brown, Pond Oreille Fire District Number 4.
Major Robert A. Palmer, U.S. Army.
Corporal James B. Searles, U.S. Army, Chestertown Volunteer Fire Department.
Firefighter Nicholas L. Johnson, Rame Fire Department.
Corporal Christopher M. Dodd, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Garrick L. Frazier, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Michelle A. McGrath, the United Marine Corps.
Sergeant Anthony R. Maddox, U.S. Army.
Lance Corporal Jonathan E. Girk, U.S. Marine Corps.
Army Specialist Zachary R. Millspaw, U.S. Army.
Specialist Cody M. Adams, U.S. Army.
Specialist 4, Kenneth W. Olange, U.S. Army.
Deputy Sheriff Hugh E. Thomas, Jr., Seminole County Sheriff's Office.
Staff Sergeant Edward A. Winkleman, United States Army.
Police Officer David F. Balkovets, Army National Guard, Smyrna Police Department.
Specialist Ryan J. Frere, United States Army.
Corporal Michael A. Downey, U.S. Marine Corps.
Corporal Joshua R. Hunt, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Dustin J. Parrott, U.S. Army.
Captain Andrew M. Pedersen Keel, U.S. Army.
Specialist 5th Class and Deputy Sheriff James Dillon, Jr., U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, Tuscareras County and Harrison County Sheriff's Office.
Staff Sergeant Dimitri W. McClintock, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Metugel A. Martinez, the United Marine Corps.
Captain Joseph M. Berkson, U.S. Army.
Corporal Henry E. DeFabio, Sr., U.S. Army.
Sergeant Ralph M. Walser, U.S. Army.
Specialist Austin L. Valley, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Stephen M. Hastings, United States Army.
Colonel Craig M. Lightfoot, U.S. Air Force.
Master Sergeant James L. Rains, U.S. Army.
Specialist 5th Class and Deputy Sheriff James Dillon, Jr., U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, Tuscarawas County and Harrison County Sheriff's Office.
Sergeant Eric L. Toth, Army National Guard. Sergeant Anthony R. Maddox, U.S. Army.
Private First Class James L. Salaji, United States Army.
EMT and firefighter Matthew W. Martin, St. Johns County Fire Rescue.
Corporal Karen N. Clifton, U.S. Army.
Master Sergeant Jeffrey C. Brer, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Terry L. Peterson, U.S. Marine Corps. Petty Officer 3rd Class Gerald L. Tomlin, U.S. Navy.
Army Specialist Daniel G. Dolan, U.S. Army.
Police Officer Jason M. Seals, Slidell Police Department.
Sergeant Bradley J. Pierce, United States Marine Corps.
Private First Class Gene S. Smith, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Justin L. Marrero, U.S. Army.
Master Sergeant Brian M. Baldwin, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant Adam J. Davis, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant First Class Stephen T. Wright, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Michael A. Dahl, Jr., U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Alexander A. Rodriguez, Jr., U.S. Army.
Specialist Brian L. Portwine, U.S. Army.
Specialist Stephen J. McBroom, U.S. Army.
Sergeant David N. Stanton, Jr., U.S. Army.
Lance Corporal John E. Bowman, U.S. Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant Kazimir V. Grayuski, U.S. Army.
Chief Warrant Officer for Mason D. Deering, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Richard A. Essex, United States Army.
Police Officer Emily A. Breidenbach, Chautette Police Department.
Chief Warrant Officer 3, Thomas L. Miller, Army National Guard.
Captain James L. Harper, U.S. Air Force.
Private Tylor D. James, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Caleb N. Thornson, U.S. Air Force.
Police Officer John C. Nix, Sheffield Police Department.
First Lieutenant John R. Ball, U.S. Army.
Fire Chief Curtis D. Brown, Delhart Volunteer Fire Department.
Specialist Robert L. Lewis, U.S. Army. Sergeant Clifford R. Harper, U.S. Army.
Sergeant First Class Jeff D. Maddox, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer Third Class and Private Nathan A. Lykip, U.S. Navy, U.S. Army.
Corporal and Deputy Sheriff Quentin J. Carroll, U.S. Marine Corps and Independence County Sheriff's Office.
Lance Corporal Eugene C. Mills III, U.S. Marine Corps.
Senior Airman Timothy M. Morgan, United States Air Force.
Staff Sergeant Michael S. Lemert, Sr., U.S. Army.
Deputy Fire Chief Richard O'Brien, Warren Fire Department.
Lance Corporal Sean M.N. O'Connor, U.S. Marine Corps.
Lieutenant Colonel Theodore L. Mitchell, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Kenneth G. Ross, U.S. Army.
Lance Corporal Jesus Gonzalez, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Eddie L. Massey Sr., U.S. Army.
Private First Class Harold S. Sussel, U.S. Army.
Specialist Carlo B. Bio, Army National Guard.
Commander Patrick S. Dunn, U.S. Navy.
Petty Officer Third Class Anthony F. Jones, Jr., U.S. Navy.
Lance Corporal Terry E. Honeycutt, Jr., United States Marine Corps.
Petty Officer First Class Richard L. Quick, Jr., U.S. Navy.
Army Specialist Zachary R. Klauser, U.S. Army.
Specialist 4th Class Ronald R. Earlywine, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Lloyd R. Osteen, U.S. Marine Corps.
Specialist James R. Shurtleff, U.S. Army.
Specialist Jeremiah J. Massey, U.S. Army.
EMT Paramedic Nicholas A. Theophilus, Rosedale Fire Department.
Specialist and Deputy Sheriff James A. Lear, U.S. Army, Van Buren County Sheriff's Office.
Lieutenant Colonel Ronald E. Stores, U.S. Air Force.
Airman First Class Lawrence J. Bellafy, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant First Class John W. Alton, U.S. Army.
Sergeant and Detective Armando Cantu Jr., U.S. Marine Corps, San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department.
Specialist Thomas T. Norgard Sr., U.S. Army.
Airman Marvin E. Katayer, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant Stephen A. Flogger, U.S. Army.
Airman First Class Michael K. Mahoney, U.S. Air Force.
Army Specialist Amanda M. Tyler, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Kent L. DeLoche, U.S. Army.
Captain John J. Levulis, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Christian D. Ward, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Keith W. Ritudian, U.S. Air Force.
First Lieutenant Joseph T. Albright, U.S. Army.
Corporal Sean J. Sturgis, U.S. Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant Keith R. Bishop, U.S. Army. Specialist Kylie Williams, U.S. Army.
Master Sergeant Mark J. Davey, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Shane M. Appleton, U.S. Air Force.
Staff Sergeant David P. Nowacek, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Patrick Hyde, Army National Guard.
Sergeant Joshua A. Aguilar, Army National Guard.
Specialist Nathan J. Balding, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Nicholas C. Panapinto, U.S. Army.
Specialist 4th Class Ronnie J. Coffrin, U.S. Army.
Lieutenant Adrian J. Almendarez, Bayer Bulverde Fire Department.
Staff Sergeant Andrew S. Novick, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Brian A. Harlan, U.S. Army. Private Jeffrey R. O'Connor, U.S. Marine Corps.
Corporal Alfred R. Inslee, Jr., U.S. Marine Corps.
Master Sergeant Joseph M. Hubbard, Army National Guard.
Technician 4th Grade Americo Arojo, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Dale J. Beard, U.S. Marine Corps.
Private First Class George C. Whitley Sr., U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Marco Severin, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer Second Class Michael R. Coatney, U.S. Navy.
Specialist Colin R. Shocknell, U.S. Army.
Specialist Randy E. Newell, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Corey L. Hicks, U.S. Army. Lance Corporal Clayton L. May, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant First Class Dustin J. Teeters, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Matthew R. Lowenthal, U.S. Marine Corps. Petty Officer Second Class Harry D. Andrews, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant First Class Jonathan M. Downing, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Vern E. Wester, U.S. Air Force, Army National Guard.
Specialist Brandon R. Standifer, U.S. Army.
Specialist 4 Donald A. Sargent, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Andrew D. Coburn, U.S. Army.
Captain John J. Sachs, U.S. Marine Corps.
Private First Class Keith M. Williams, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Charles H. Billingsley Sr., U.S. Air Force.
Staff Sergeant Joseph A. Beal, Army National Guard.
Private First Class Marvin A. Van Artsel, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Isaac H. Milliken, U.S. Army.
Specialist William E. Anderson, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Eric W. Patchen, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Louis A. Cordero, U.S. Army.
Private First Class James R. Cole, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer First Class and Firefighter Charles A. Norris, U.S. Navy, Point Pleasant Fire Department.
Sergeant Kevin Quiros, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Deontay D. Allen, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Burton A. Trammell, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant John D. Allen, U.S. Army.
Corporal Marshal A. Lupke, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Tyler W. Ziegel, U.S. Marine Corps.
Technical Sergeant Kenneth O. Santiago, U.S. Air Force.
Army Specialist Farron R. Cross, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Joshua C. Gore, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Casey F. Hensley, Army National Guard.
Specialist Anthony J. L. Wida, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Nicholas R. Carnes, Army National Guard.
Senior Master Sergeant Christopher L. Crawford, U.S. Air Force.
Private First Class Jason R. Stevens, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Michael R. Atker, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Jeremy D. Dixon, U.S. Marine Corps.
Specialist Blake W. Hall, U.S. Army.
Gunnery Sergeant Paul V. Kane, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant First Class Jesse B. Albright, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Keith W. Ratuyan, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant Richard J. Keeter, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Timmy D. Holler, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Darren J. Dennis, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Levi W. Derby, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer Third Class George D. Campbell, U.S. Navy.
Corporal Russell C. Stensing, Jr., U.S. Army.
Second Lieutenant Joseph H. Lloyd, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Terry W. Prater, U.S. Army.
Specialist James W. Newell, U.S. Army.
Corporal Nelson J. Almy, Sr., U.S. Army.
Specialist Jeremy M. Hines, U.S. Army.
Private Second Class Carl A. Schaefer, U.S. Army.
Gunnery Sergeant Michael J. Clark, U.S. Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant Michael L. Keith, Jr., U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Kerry L. Eason, Polk County Sheriff's Office.
Sergeant John J. Klum, U.S. Marine Corps.
Technical Sergeant Matthew J. Sonic, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant John T. Braun, U.S. Air Force.
Technical Sergeant Brian M. Theobald, U.S. Air Force.
Corporal Jeffrey W. Johnson, U.S. Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant Jacob E. Sibley, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant Cody W. Donahue, U.S. Army.
Chief Warrant Officer Robert W. Neighbors, U.S. Army.
Lieutenant Michael P. Murphy, U.S. Navy. Specialist George Salato, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Donald K. Broughton, U.S. Army Air Corps.
Staff Sergeant Anthony L. Mason, Army National Guard.
Staff Sergeant John R. Wade, United States Army.
Seaman Recruit Eric Borshenius, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant Andrew P. Idle, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Michael A. Hatfield, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Randolph T. Chong Tim, Jr., U.S. Army.
Specialist John M.S. Luttrell, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Alan B. Caldwell, United States Army.
Seaman Froyland J. Rosales, U.S. Navy.
Lance Corporal Brian C. Hopper, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer 3rd Class Chad B. Fetter, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant Joshua O. Tipton, U.S. Army.
Specialist Roy J. Palmer, U.S. Army.
Corporal and Officer Abel J. Hickman, U.S. Marine Corps, FCC Victorville.
Lance Corporal Joshua B. McDaniels, U.S. Marine Corps.
Lance Corporal Lance B. Chavez, U.S. Marine Corps.
Master Sergeant Stanley E. Willman, U.S. Air Force.
Private First Class Ronald E. Hibbard, U.S. Marine Corps.
Seaman William G. Basden, U.S. Navy.
Staff Sergeant Joseph K. Robison, U.S. Army.
Specialist John R. Schlegel, U.S. Army.
Master Sergeant Melissa T. Wasowski, Army National Guard.
Chief Petty Officer Gary W. Hubner, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant David D. Taylor II, U.S. Marine Corps.
Master Sergeant Joseph R. Feister, Jr., U.S. Army.
Sergeant First Class David G. Hannaford, United States Army.
Sergeant Thomas A. Simpson, U.S. Marine Corps.
Specialist Nicholas L. Bowman, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Matthew R. Fishman, Mount Olive Police Department, Wayne County Sheriff's Office.
Sergeant Edward Percola, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer First Class Connor W. Baker, United States Navy.
Staff Sergeant Alan J. Hedlund, U.S. Air National Guard.
Private First Class Andrew J. Shields, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer First Class and Firefighter Wendell K. Daniel, U.S. Navy, Kilbourne Fire Department.
Corporal Joseph E. Hyatt, U.S. Marine Corps.
Technical Sergeant Franklin J. Trombley, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant Robert A. Hendricks, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer 2nd Class William C. Metzel, U.S. Navy.
Specialist 4th Class Monty L. Truax, U.S. Army.
Private First Class J.V. Patrick, United States Army.
Staff Sergeant Zachary R. Townsend, U.S. Air Force.
Private First Class Philip E. Breeding, U.S. Army.
Senior Airman and Fire Chief Lloyd A. Segner, U.S. Air Force, Northwestern Fire Department, which is formerly known as the Liberty Township Fire Department.
Captain Gary R. Reed, U.S. Army.
Specialist Donato Reynoso, Jr., U.S. Army.
Firefighter and paramedic Jacek Brylinski, Rolling Meadows Fire Department.
Sergeant Terrence T. Hinton, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Mark J. Estopere, U.S. Army.
Private Ernest W. Clark III, U.S. Army.
Sergeant and Senior Patrol Officer Michael D. Evans, U.S. Army, Germantown Police Department.
Technical Sergeant and EMT Philip B. Berg, United States Air Force, American Medical Response. Senior Master Sergeant John R. Verberg, U.S. Air Force.
Specialist Tyler E. L. Hankins, Army National Guard.
Private Jonathan M. Busbin, U.S. Army.
Corporal Christopher D. Winchester, United States Marine Corps.
Sergeant Enrique M. Hurtado, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer 2nd Class Robert G. Dixon, U.S. Navy.
Private First Class and Captain Jesse C. Tirabiate, U.S. Marine Corps, La Marquis Fire Department.
Sergeant Joshua D. Smith, United States Army.
Petty Officer, First Class, and Firefighter Charles A. Norris, U.S. Navy, Point Pleasant Fire Department.
Specialist Larry M. Clinton, Army National Guard.
Staff Sergeant Marcus C. Verrett, U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Army.
Sergeant Dylan D. Young, U.S. Marine Corps.
Command Sergeant Major Clyde W. Worrell, Army National Guard.
Airman Isaiah C. Brown, U.S. Navy.
Petty Officer First Class Stephen G. Demovic, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant Kenneth J. Lyon, Jr., U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant and Chaplain Eugene L. Edwards, Jr., U.S. Army, Rochester Fire Protectives.
Private First Class Jerry C. Clute, U.S. Army.
Lance Corporal Hunter C. Whitley, United States Marine Corps.
Sergeant and Patrolman Alexander C. Guerrera, U.S. Marine Corps and California Highway Patrol.
Sergeant Jose C. Martinez, U.S. Marine Corps.
Master Sergeant Richard A. Alejandro, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Kenneth D. Bennett, United States Marine Corps.
Sergeant Joshua A. Hester, Army National Guard.
Lieutenant Commander Richard C. Herbal, U.S. Navy.
Staff Sergeant Calvin Morgan Coffer, U.S. Marine Corps.
Master Sergeant Richard C. McGibney, Sr., U.S. Air Force.
Corporal Stephen W. Scamahorn, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Ronald M. Wells, U.S. Army.
Sergeant First Class Matthew K. Evans, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Grant O. Hunsaker, U.S. Army.
Specialist Lance L. Casas, U.S. Army.
Specialist Joey M. Lentz, United States Army.
Sergeant Robert Luna, U.S. Army.
Police Officer Gerald J. Goff, U.S. Marine Corps, Chicago Police Department.
Master at Arms, Petty Officer Second Class, Cody J.D. Cannon, U.S. Navy.
Deputy Sheriff Charles B. Venata, U.S. Border Patrol, Curry County Sheriff's Office, Texaco Police Department.
Sergeant Nathaniel Baller, U.S. Army.
Corporal Logan W. Kastner, United States Marine Corps.
Senior Investigator Thomas M. O'Neill, New York State Police.
Petty Officer First Class Stephen G. Dejmovic, U.S. Navy.
Petty Officer Third Class Robert T. Robertson, U.S. Navy.
Private First Class Michael A. Thomason, United States Army.
Lieutenant Adrian J. Almendarez, Bay Air Bulverde Fire Department.
Technical Sergeant Cody W. Ball, U.S. Air Force.
Deputy Sheriff Peter J. Herrera, El Paso County Sheriff's Office.
Chief Warrant Officer Aaron D. Mosdell, U.S. Army.
Specialist Justin A. Rollins, U.S. Army.
Corporal Ralph J. Altamere, U.S. Army.
Specialist Paul L. Smith, U.S. Army, U.S. Navy.
Lance Corporal Dale B. Hewitt, U.S. Marine Corps, Army Reserve.
EMT and Firefighter Justin L. Sanders, Mansfield Fire Department.
Corrections Officer and Lieutenant Robert L. McFarland, Anamosa Penitentiary, Ely Fire Department.
Specialist Nicholas T. Polk, U.S. Army.
Firefighter J.C. J. Braun, Victoria, Ellis County Fire Department.
Staff Sergeant Michael L. Burbank, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Nicholas C. Panapinto, United States Army.
Specialist Kenneth J. Iwasinski, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Giovanni S. Perez Ciernos, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Jeremy M. Campbell, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Richard L. Johnson, U.S. Army.
Specialist Leroy J. LaFontaine, U.S. Army.
Police Officer and Firefighter Gary L. Schroeder Jr., Zumbrata Police Department and Fire Department.
Corporal Justin L. Huff, U.S. Marine Corps.
Police Officer Jeffrey H. Carson, Franklin Police Department.
Staff Sergeant Joshua S. Bolino, U.S. Marine Corps.
Lieutenant Corey T. Kirk, Borger Fire Department.
Sergeant Kevin A. Van Donsel, U.S. Army.
Corporal and Firefighter George R. Allen III, U.S. Marine Corps and Rivers Point Fire Department.
Private First Class Ethan A. Lawrence, U.S. Army.
Warrant Officer Terry F. Mazzara, United States Army.
Corporal Seth D. Rasmussen, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer 2nd Class William C. Matzel, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant Justin A. Samuels, U.S. Army.
Sergeant and Firefighter Thomas C. Wagner, U.S. Army, Panama Fire Department.
Chief Petty Officer Douglas M. Sanders, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant Austin J. Millard, Army National Guard.
Private First Class Eric D. Hayes, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Thomas L. Latham, U.S. Army.
Master Sergeant Jeffrey A. Somm, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer 3rd Class Ryan L. Richards, United States Navy.
Staff Sergeant Lawrence Woods, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer 1st Class Robert H. Crouch, Jr., U.S. Navy.
Specialist Wayne R. Wilson, U.S. Army.
Specialist Darren M. DeBate, Army National Guard.
Sergeant Dwayne E. Cubberly, Army National Guard.
Lance Corporal Michael L. Freeman, Jr., U.S. Marine Corps.
Police Officer James Stevenson, Gila River Police Department.
Sergeant 1st Class Jonathan K. Dozier, U.S. Army.
Chief Petty Officer Lloyd Wilson, U.S. Navy.
Lance Corporal Jeremy S. Schock, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Jacob J. Chanel Crespo, U.S. Marine Corps.
Major Christopher R. Nogle, United States Army.
Sergeant and Patrolman Aubrey F. Hill, U.S. Marine Corps and Newton Police Department.
Staff Sergeant Forrest B. Sibley, U.S. Air Force.
Deputy Sheriff Douglas W. Sanford, Hamilton County Sheriff's Office.
Sergeant John R. Kennedy, U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Army.
Private 2nd Class Tyler T. Brown, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant William T. Girdles, U.S. Air Force.
Colonel Troy M. Hollowitty, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer 2nd Class Daniel R. Beard, U.S. Navy.
Lieutenant Colonel James D. McNamara, U.S. Army.
Private Leopoldo H. Soto, Army National Guard.
Specialist 3rd Class David J. Fall, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer 2nd Class Craig A. Brown, U.S. Navy.
Canine Officer Sierra B. Burton, Richmond Police Department.
Specialist Zachary L. Shannon, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer 1st Class Chado S. DeYoung, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant Charles R. Lashat, U.S. Army.
Senior Airman Melanie S. Locklear, U.S. Air Force.
Corporal Christian M. Hicks, U.S. Marine Corps.
Private First Class Carrie J. Atterbury, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Jorge L. Socola, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Denise Jimenez, United States Army.
Sergeant First Class Wesley N. Hampton, U.S. Army.
Private Second Class Maurice L. Bloom, U.S. Army Air Corps. Private Harry J. Rose, U.S. Army.
Master Sergeant Gregory A. Menza, United States Army.
Petty Officer, Second Class, Matthew C. Randolph, U.S. Navy.
Police Chief Stephen E. DeSario, Kirkersville Police Department.
Corporal Drake A. Bolano, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer First Class James L. Hughes, U.S. Navy.
Private First Class Robert V. Swain, U.S. Army.
Corporal Dalton T. Milnes, U.S. Marine Corps.
Chief Warrant Officer 3, Larry Vargas Jr., U.S. Army.
Airman First Class Austin T. E. Davis, U.S. Air Force.
Specialist Quasiano L. Emmanuel, U.S. Army.
Corporal Frederick J.C. Fisher, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Austin L. Clark, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Richard B. Hardy, U.S. Army.
Specialist Kevin S. Dubois, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer Third Class Cody L. Decker, United States Navy.
First Sergeant Terry L. Dover, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Dale G. Peace, U.S. Army.
Technical Sergeant Joshua L. Kidd, U.S. Air Force.
Petty Officer Third Class Perry W. Johnson, U.S. Navy.
Private First Class Daniel R. Criswell, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Megan R. Burke, Oklahoma Police Department.
Master Sergeant Matthew J. Brosis, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant David I. Ladart, U.S. Army.
Specialist Zachary D. Adamson, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Richard P. DeFrancisco, U.S. Air Force.
Lieutenant Colonel Shepard A. McKenzie Jr., U.S. Army Air Corps.
Seaman Shane C. Sackett, U.S. Navy.
Technical Sergeant William F. Haney, U.S. Air Force.
Captain Derek J. DeHoe, United States Army National Guard.
Petty Officer Third Class Dalton C. Gray, United States Navy.
Seaman Recruit Russell J. Kamen Jr., U.S. Navy.
Specialist Alan J. Burgess, Army National Guard.
Patrolman Vincent A. Parks, Jonesboro Police Department.
Seaman Mark D. Hamilton, U.S. Navy.
Sergeant First Class Adam J. Donaldson, U.S. Army.
Corporal Alex Martinez, U.S. Marine Corps.
Specialist Adam C. Duvall, Army National Guard.
Private First Class Eric J. Miller, U.S. Army.
Chief Petty Officer Robert S. Weimer, U.S. Navy.
Deputy Laura A. James, Livingston Parish Sheriff's Office.
Sergeant Keith D. Yenny II, U.S. Marine Corps.
Specialist Stephen F. Heine, Army National Guard.
Sergeant and Captain Vincent N. Liberto Jr., United States Marine Corps, Maddenville Police Department.
Specialist Cody A. Wibble, U.S. Army.
Sergeant and Fire Chief Richard C. Abresh, U.S. Air Force, Taylor Township Fire Department, Howard County Emergency Management Agency.
Specialist Christopher Padilla, U.S. Army.
Master Sergeant Samuel A. Messel, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant Thomas E. Koenig, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant First Class Joshua M. James, U.S. Army.
Corporal Richard A. Gomez, U.S. Marine Corps.
Captain Connor J. Benazark, U.S. Army.
Lance Corporal and Firefighter Jeremy J. McKay, U.S. Marine Corps, Clay County Fire Rescue.
Sergeant Herbert M. Albert, U.S. Marine Corps.
Staff Sergeant Wendell K. Riddle, U.S. Army.
Army Specialist Nicholas F. Pelosi, United States Army.
Gunnery Sergeant Herman J. Murkerson, Jr., U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant First Class Jonathan W. Hoos, Army National Guard.
Staff Sergeant Cyril P. Cummings, U.S. Army Air Force.
Sergeant Jimmy W. Green, U.S. Army.
Private First Class Drew S. Culler Waters, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Jason A. Westrick, U.S. Army.
Firefighter Brendan L. Torres, Dalhart Volunteer Fire Department.
Specialist Roy B. Mason II, United States Army.
Private First Class Alan J. Austin, U.S. Army.
Corporal Selwyn G. Clark, Jr., U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Calvin R. Hull, U.S. Army and Army National Guard.
Chief Master Sergeant Corinne E. Amable, United States Air Force.
Corporal Saunders T. Gibson, U.S. Marine Corps.
Sergeant Nicholas A. Casey, U.S. Army.
Lance Corporal Dakota R. Hughes, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer, 3rd Class Mark A. Knight, U.S. Navy.
Chief Petty Officer Roland E. Harrell, United States Navy.
Specialist Scott L. Jeans, U.S. Army, Army National Guard.
Petty Officer 3rd Class David S. Janelle, U.S. Navy.
Petty Officer 3rd Class Gary H. Brown, U.S. Navy.
Senior Airman Daniel J. Vidrin, U.S. Air Force.
Sergeant First Class Ernest L. Lowe, U.S. Army.
Sergeant Arthur A. Mora, Jr., U.S. Army.
Sergeant Hayden E. West, U.S. Army.
Specialist Eric T. Burry, U.S. Army.
Seaman Ian H. Laughlin, U.S. Navy.
Lance Corporal Scott A. Lynch, U.S. Marine Corps.
Major John S. Dabrowski, U.S. Army.
Petty Officer 2nd Class Stephen V. Rickers, U.S. Navy.
Senior Master Sergeant John R. Verberg, U.S. Air Force.
Airman First Class Christian M. Van Wagner, U.S. Air Force.
Lance Corporal David K. Fribley, U.S. Marine Corps.
Petty Officer 2nd Class and Firefighter Michael G. Penny, U.S. Navy, Taft City Fire Department.
Sergeant Edward W. Kohler III, U.S. Marine Corps, Army National Guard.
Major Garland J. Woolfolk, U.S. Army.
Staff Sergeant Teddy L. Kiefer, Army National Guard.
Petty Officer First Class John J. Geiger, U.S. Navy.
Corporal Elmer C. Dawn, U.S. Army.